Hey, this is Terry, and in this video, I want to provide some tips and tricks for setting up the Allt-i-Ett. Now, it might be easily understood that a product with this many features and functionalities requires a video like this, but it's also a case that because of the sophisticated design on every level, that it does warrant very careful setup to make sure you get the most out of this complex product. And one of the ways of kind of illustrating that is just taking a look at the driver design. In the case of the tweeter, I'm very pleased that we're using a cardioid back chamber to dissipate the back wave or vent the back wave from the tweeter itself. Now, this is not a large signal, as you might imagine, but because of that delicacy, it's really important to control that in a way that's very efficient. And by using this cardioid dome, so in other words, instead of just a circular dome, it has a point to it that then quite naturally diffuses the back wave without having to resort to any kind of foams that could otherwise cause levels of compression or not a free flow of the energy within the dome tweeter itself. It's really a sophisticated design element. Similar, in fact, to that we have for the mid-bass driver, the mid-range and the low-frequency driver, in that it is an open basket design. And what this means is that the space behind the spider, which is this pleated bit of fabric here that kind of holds the voice coil and the diaphragm within the basket itself, is open. Now, in some designs, that's closed. And there's a potential then that with the air moving, especially at low frequencies, the compression of the air in that space could prevent the woofer from moving in a linear fashion. So by making sure that it's open, we have this very efficient exchange of air to make sure that the woofer is not impeded in any way. And it's one of the reasons why we have such this wonderfully delicate, nuanced, and powerful bass from the Allt-i-Ett. Now, part of the reason for that too is that there's been very careful DSP of the basic elements, the amplifier as well as the crossovers. There's a digital crossover for the woofer with a passive crossover for the tweeter and mid-range to make sure that we get the best sound possible from the Allt-i-Ett. And then in order to ensure that all of that works properly is the reason for this video, the tips and tricks that I'm now about to begin talking about. So when you first set your Allt-i-Ett up, obviously you need to plug in your AC power cord, but that requires some attention in and of itself, particularly if you're in Europe and use the EU plug that can be inserted into the socket either 0 or 180 degrees. And so to ensure that you've got the right phase or the right orientation of that plug in the socket, we've included an AC polarity checking pin. Once you put the batteries in this, then you will take the tip of this with the unit turned on and put it to either the outside or the inside edge of the AC plug. It should light up when it's essentially in this orientation touching the plug. And that means you have the proper AC orientation or the AC phase on your Allt-i-Ett. If it doesn't, if it lights up on the outside, then you know you need to turn the plug in the wall socket 180 degrees and then recheck, and it should light up from this side. And then you know that the Allt-i-Ett is getting the power that's just right to take most advantage of the power supply that's energizing the entire circuitry of the Allt-i-Ett. Now, this is not really that important for places where they have keyed plugs like in the EU or the UK, but it could very well be that your socket itself may not be connected correctly, and that you might want to see about getting that fixed by an electrician because we are talking about lethal voltages, particularly in the UK. Now, once you've got that set up and once you've got the unit turned on, that initial turn on time could be considerable, maybe 15 minutes, because it may be needing to do an OTA, an update. We will continually be improving the firmware and software package that's in the Allt-i-Ett, and so upon initially opening it up, it's very possible that new firmware is available, and it will want to download and install that before doing anything else. So again, if you see that it is not yet fully turned on, leave it alone, have some patience, because this could take some time. In fact, even after the initial turn on, once you take this out of standby, it could take a little while for all of these systems to be checked and installed and ready for use when you first take it out of standby. This is particularly true if you've set up Bacch 3D sound, because Bacch is a very kind of intensive firmware that needs to be loaded up each time you bring it out of standby, and this can take a full 20 seconds for that to load. So again, have some patience as the unit starts up. Now, if you don't have that kind of patience, if you want to have it starting right away, then you'll need to maybe turn the Bacch 3D sound off and then turn it on as you need it, as you want to listen more critically to the system. But just keep those things in mind as it comes up out of standby. Then, once it's out of standby the first time, what we really you need to do is to set the placement setting. Now, it's either on wall, in corner, or out in free space. Now, you could assume that if your Allt-i-Ett is against the wall or in a corner or out in free space, that's the setting you should choose. However, what we found that in certain situations, that may not necessarily be the best setting. Just because of the description doesn't necessarily mean that that will be the best output for the Allt-i-Ett. And so we suggest that you listen to that first and find one of the settings that works best for you. The free space one, the open air one, will have a little bit more bass. And so in this case, in the situation that I have here underneath my TV, I am kind of on the wall, but I am a good half meter from it. And so that's where I find that the open air setting works best in this installation. You might prefer, and it can be a matter of personal preference, you might prefer one or the other setting. So take the time to just quickly listen to see which one you prefer. Then, once you've got that placement setting in, do the auto room EQ, and really do the auto room EQ. This allows the Allt-i-Ett to truly then work best with the acoustic characteristics of the room itself. And it is kind of one of those things that's really remarkable in the sense that in certain rooms, in my room, for example, I have a bit of a bass boost simply because of the natural acoustics of this room. And therefore, what the auto room EQ is able to do is bring some of those non-linearities, those peaks down, so that the bass really is much more uniform, clear, detailed. It means that the bass output reduces subtly, but then you hear all the textures, all of the kind of harmonics in the bass, as well as its rhythmic structure much better. So make sure you do the auto room EQ. Now, that can be done just with an iOS device and the microphones that are built into it. If you have an Android, you'll need to use a Zen microphone. It's on the 2.4 band of your Wi-Fi, so make sure that you're set up on 2.4 to be able to make it work effectively with your mobile device and with the Allt-i-Ett. And in fact, while we're talking about 2.4, we recommend that in any case. It is the bandwidth that is better for distance control of your mobile devices. You don't need the speed of delivery that 5 provides, so go to 2.4, it's more stable and it has a greater range. So whether you're using the Zen microphone, and you can use it with iOS devices for subtle improvement in the performance, you will want to make sure that you put the microphone or the mobile device anywhere you think you might want to be listening to the Allt-i-Ett. We discovered just how precise this is at a trade show that we did in Melma, where we were setting up to demonstrate the Allt-i-Ett, the first public showing of it, and we put the microphone or the iOS device really at the listening positions, ear level. And we then listened to the results. And when we were sitting, it was great, but the minute we stood up, stood behind the listening area, it didn't sound as good as we thought it could. And so we did the re-EQ again, and making sure that we put it at heights where people would be standing and listening as well as sitting and listening. And so what this means is make sure that wherever in your room you think you might be listening to the Allt-i-Ett, even less than critically, make sure you put that device there to make sure that it configures itself to provide the best and most uniform performance throughout the room, wherever you might want to listen. Obviously, you might want to concentrate on your main listening position, but make sure you get it into those various locations of the room where you'll be listening, and the results will be quite extraordinary. In fact, what will happen then is that there will be this sense that the sound really isn't coming from the Allt-i-Ett, that it really is coming from this kind of space, what you might expect, say, between the speakers that I have here in this setup, where I've been doing testing of the Allt-i-Ett here at my home. Where things get really interesting is when you turn on Bach 3D sound. Now, Bach 3D sound is a very sophisticated DSP program that comes out of the physics lab of a university in the United States, and it is very, very sophisticated in what it does. And to a certain degree, it can be somewhat mistakenly described as providing immersive sound. And I want to manage some expectations here because it isn't surround sound. Because when you talk about, say, stereo output, surround sound output, you do have these zones of output that definitely define your soundstage. So in the case of a 2-channel, you've got the zone of power coming from the speakers that defines kind of a soundstage on the plane of the speakers. Now, you might get some greater three-dimensionality given the nature of your setup, the room, the recording, that kind of thing, but it is really kind of from this plane. Now, if you're talking about surround sound, when you've got the speakers at these various locations, you're working very hard to set up this bubble. And it does kind of contain you. That soundstage is kind of contained in the sense of a bubble. In the case of Bach, it blows apart that bubble. It blows apart that plane and provides you with a three-dimensional spatial representation of the recording. Now, this doesn't mean that you're going to have constant things whirling around behind you. What it means is the height, the depth, the accuracy, the space between the musical instruments is really going to be quite remarkable, particularly when it's coming from a single compact box like the Allt-i-Ett. In fact, as I've been listening and testing at home, I have these really remarkable Martin loudspeakers very carefully set up. And when I get Bach involved, it essentially occupies a soundstage that is not dissimilar to what I'm able to get with these very sophisticated Martin loudspeakers. Martins are better, but this does a job that is astonishing. And so don't expect that with every recording some stuff will be happening around you. Although I did have an experience once while I was testing where I thought my wife was calling to me from the bedroom behind me and to the back of me, only to discover there was actually background vocalists in the recording I was listening to. And in fact, that leads me to the topic of the recordings themselves. This will have much more of effect with something that is set up with ambient cues, with ambient space that's articulated within the recording, or phase relationships within the recording that will give you this greater sense. And so when you're listening to something, say, a television or movie soundtrack, that obviously had those cues built in so that you will get this greater sense of development. If you're listening to a naturally recording classical or jazz recording or a live recording, those effects will be more apparent than if you're listening to much more of a kind of controlled, say, pop recording that has everything just in the center of the sound field. And so with those recordings, especially like a live recording, all of a sudden you get the sense of the space around you. You may not have things happening around you. There may not be recorded instruments or even kind of the sound of the audience behind you, but there'll be that sense of space, that sense of scale that's really quite remarkable. And so once you have that all set up, you're ready to listen. Now, one of the things I failed to mention about RoomEQ is that when you're setting up for RoomEQ, you'll notice that its low frequency output is set to 35 cycles, even though you can set it to 20. The reason why it sets to 35 is that's the relative roll-off of the Allt-i-Ett, about 6 dB down at 35 Hertz. And so this is the reason why you might want to plug in a subwoofer. That subwoofer will extend the bass and provide greater output capability because we recommend that you set that crossover frequency to 80 Hertz in the subwoofer controls here in the Allt-i-Ett. By doing that, you are able then to augment the bass, relieve the Allt-i-Ett from producing those low frequencies, and be able to play bigger, louder, and then in the case of a movie soundtrack, with some of that greater, more low frequency implosions that you might expect. And so once you've got either just the Allt-i-Ett set up and dialed in or with a subwoofer, you then can go in and do further tweaking with the RoomEQ, sorry, not the RoomEQ, with the graphic equalizer that's built into the Prisma application. But one thing that I needed to note about this is that when you open up the graphic EQ, you're going to need to slide left to be able to reveal the upper frequencies that are part of the little bars that you raise and lower the various frequencies. Otherwise, you might think that it's limited to 2,000 cycles, when in actual fact, if you slide left, you'll reveal that it works up all the way to 16,000 cycles. And now that equalizer will work with your box settings, with your RoomEQ settings, with your subwoofer settings, so that you're able then to kind of tweak to taste whatever output that you want to have from the total system. So all of those things combined allow you then to really tune the system for the room. Now let's talk about some inputs. And if we're talking about subwoofers, we might as well talk about the HDMI input from your television. Now, when you're setting this up, the key thing to remember is that this does not have Dolby processing in it. The Allt-i-Ett is not a Dolby processor. So what you'll need to do is go into your television settings and select PCM output. Once you've done that, everything locks together, both the CEC controls and then the delivery of signal to the Allt-i-Ett for playback, and everything works great. Just don't expect to have it work with Dolby output. So don't set it to auto or Dolby, set it to PCM output on your television. Now, when we're talking about other inputs, we also start talking about things like radio, FM and DB+. Now, here's the thing about FM and DB+, particularly in an installation like what we have here. This antenna will provide better reception for both of those. The problem is it does kind of intrude on the image on the television. So you may want to access radio through other means, either through AirPlay with things like TuneIn, radio aggregators like TuneIn, or other radio stations that are available on apps that can be easily then sent to the Allt-i-Ett through AirPlay, or use the Prisma radio that's available to you within the Prisma app. And now we also have in the Prisma app Tidal and Qobuz, but because with this Allt-i-Ett having both Spotify Connect and Qobuz Connect and a Tidal Connect, we suggest that you use any of the Connect platforms for the best performance from those streaming services. And before I forget about radio, make sure that when you are setting up your radio that you set your preferred stations. You can do that very simply by selecting a station and then pressing one of the 6 preset buttons where a field will come up asking if you want to set it as your preferred setting and do you want to set it to that number. You say yes, and it will automatically be set to that number that you've selected. Now, this can be a mix of FM and DB+ stations. It doesn't really matter. One other thing before I close, once you've done all of this to set the unit up, if you're listening critically, it may be a good idea to pull the grill off. Now, in normal settings with a lifestyle product like this, you'll want to leave the grill on. But if you are listening critically, particularly with the Bacch 3D sound set, this will give you subtly better output, particularly from the transmission line or the waveguide tweeter and the mid-range driver. And so if you do find yourself, given the capability of the Allt-i-Ett, listening critically, do try taking the grill off. You might find that it does improve things even more than you might have expected. And I think that about covers it. But if there are other questions or other things that come up, make sure you go to our website, look at the user guide there. If your question isn't answered, please fill out a help request, and one of the team that actually designed the product will answer your questions and help you out. And so with that in mind, just go to our website, check out the Allt-i-Ett, look at the user guide, ask us a question if you want through the help request form, with the hope that you will enjoy your Allt-i-Ett to the fullest.